over to Twitter. Go
Wait,
live.
did you send me that link in chat?
I did.
Why does nothing seem to be showing? Unless it's coming through on my phone or something? That's all I can
It's on your chat and it's on the Twitter. And we are live. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to another episode of the Cardboard Heralds Off the Table. I am your loyal host, loyal because I'm always here for you, Jack. And joining me is my co-host, John. How are you doing, John?
Intrepid sidekick, I think is what you mean.
Exactly. Are you more the boy wonder type of sidekick? What kind of sidekick are we talking here? Maybe an Andy Richter.
I'm kind of more the Wonder Woman to your Superman, right?
Okay. I'll take that. There's a lot of, I guess, repercussions for viewing it in that context. You know, it's, I'm sure the psychiatrist would have a field day for how that shakes out. Maybe we can alternate who's Superman, who's Wonder Woman. But nonetheless, I'm glad that you're here. This show is us talking about board game news, discussion, focus topics, and just kind of hanging out. And today, our main topic, our tour de force, I don't even think that's what a tour de force is, but for the purposes of this, is expansions. And specifically, the question is, expansions, are they good? But I had a couple things to talk about before we get into that, because it's hot, not just outside here on this Independence Day weekend in the United States, which has been very hot here in Alaska, but it's been hot in the world of board games. John, people are mad at each other.
They're always mad about something, but you're going to have to clarify that. I see you've got a couple of points up here. It looks like someone's suing someone. Knizia suit? What's going on there?
There's a few lawsuits going on. So this Knizia thing, Reiner Knizia, the good doctor of board games who has, I believe, over 500 designs, or at least that's what his site purports. I think there's some skepticism in like the exact number going on there. Maybe some of those are re-releases or something, but nonetheless, he is the most prolific and in some lights, the most influential board game designer for the modern tabletop gaming hobby. And there was this bit of drama where Grail Games recently, I want to say they're out of Australia, had announced that they were no longer going to be continuing the Reiner Knizia products that they had because they weren't selling. They just weren't selling. And then Reiner Knizia and his company, his oeuvre, because, Knizia is a brand, announces, hold on, that's not true. You're no longer selling these things because you are in breach of contract. Don't go saying that it's because my games don't sell. And there was a lot of speculation back and forth as to like the legitimacy of either of these sides. It sounds like it's just kind of a mess in general, but it came to a head with a lawsuit that was announced last week. And it looks like what ended up happening is Grail Games was selling outside of the regions that they're allowed to sell. So I don't know how inside baseball you are when it comes to board games, John, but there's like, let's say I'm Reiner Knizia, Jack are Edizia, and I have like this really cool game that is a beloved game, and I own the rights to it, which is kind of the goal. Like the creative people want to own the rights to the things that they've created. And Reiner Knizia licenses those games to different publishers, saying that as long as you uphold this end of the contract, then it's going to be sold in this specific way. Here's how much I get out of it, et cetera, et cetera. Minimum numbers of units sometimes come up, that kind of stuff. And it appears that Grail Games was like, even though you have a contract to sell in this region to this other company, we're also going to sell within that region. We still are just on the outside looking in, right? We're just speculating, but it seems to be that's the case. And the way the wind is blowing is it looks like a lot of people are particularly disappointed in Grail Games, which was kind of a cool indie company, up and coming, has some recent releases that people really like. But on the other hand, people love Reiner Knizia. He's one of the mainstays. He's one of the OGs. So it seems like there's some heat going on there. And parallel to that, we have another lawsuit where Asmodee and Amazon, those small mom and pop organizations have teamed up and are going after third-party sellers who are trying to, maybe not trying to sell counterfeit products, but are enabling counterfeit products to be sold on
certainly
Amazon.
Less responsible or accountable for the product that they sell, right?
Yeah. Have you seen any of the stuff about counterfeit games come up on like forums and that kind of stuff?
I would love to hear about this one from people in comments or chat, because to be honest, it's one of those evil monsters I've read about, the boogeyman in the closet. And I've never seen it myself. It's got to be happening to somebody, but I've never had the misfortune of encountering it. So I wonder how ubiquitous it is, and what does that even look like? Is it like Spooderman? Is that how bad it is, or is it mostly the same, but like something seems a little off, and like I don't know. I'd love to see it.
There's actually someone that we know locally, teacher of your kid. He ended up getting a copy of Pandemic Legacy Season 1, which is one of the more infamously counterfeit games. And you can tell that it's a counterfeit by the quality of components just universally are so much worse. The cards are much more brittle. The colors on the printing are worse. The stickers are misaligned. And it's not like one specific issue where, you can identify that as a mistake, but across the board, it is clear that much, much cheaper products were used. And so I think the prevailing theory is that if there's like, say, 5 factories that make this game, that maybe one of the factories after hours then does a run with much more cheap materials and sells those as though they were the legitimate copies. Either way, it's becoming more and more commonplace to see on Reddit or Board Game Geek or that kind of stuff, people talking about counterfeit games. So it's a thing. It's kind of weird to me. I mean, it's not surprising to me that Asmodee and Amazon are like, yo, third-party seller, you got to crack down on this. We're suing you. But it seems like there really should be some internal measures to, stop those from hitting the marketplace in the first place,
Yeah, I mean, I gotta wonder who bears the responsibility on that, and where the source of the counterfeits are coming from. I feel like that might be its own big story there, to dive into a little deeper. But I'm curious, who are we suing here? If it's Amazon and Asmodee, those are the big daddies, right? So who are they suing exactly?
Right. Yeah, I think it's just third-party sellers who, on Amazon, you may see that it says Prime, or maybe it says, like they're going to sell it plus $5.99 shipping or something like that. But that's how they sneak in. Is Amazon has essentially made itself a marketplace where, if I start a company, then I could sell through Amazon, so long as I am adhering to their terms and conditions and everything. But, maybe I get a little sneaky, get a little cheeky and throw in my bunk copy of Root that's, called Foot or something like that, and try to make some extra bucks on the they're one of the more interesting counterfeits, which I think the counterfeits, when it is like a knockoff, are genuinely interesting. And there is a wonderful, I want to say Chinese copy of Root that is an unofficial knockoff of the game. And it's clear that that's exactly what the game is, but different artwork and different, setting and that kind of stuff. But it is 100% Foot rather than Root. And I love it. I want to see more of that.
Marvel Champions Spooderman.
Exactly. We got to have the Spoodermans. And the last thing, as far as like people getting angry, people getting up in arms, is this interesting thing. I think it's most interesting to me because I like a gray area. I like a good gray area. And I think this could make a fantastic topic in and of itself to talk about, like, how the legacy of a company or a creator, we were just talking about Reiner Knizia, how that impacts how we view the games that we play. more and more, it's becoming inescapable to consume some sort of media without knowing something having to do with it. And the reason this is coming up is TSR, the makers of famous games like Dragon Dice,
Exactly.
the original makers. SFR makes Dragon Dice these days, very different company, but the company that created Dungeons and Dragons, so monumental impact on the industry, eventually was bought by Wizards of the Coast. Well, Ernie Gygax, Gary Gygax's son, as well as I believe a couple other people have gotten together and they're like, we have the new TSR. And this isn't the first time that TSR has been attempted to be resurrected. But there's a bit of a shall we say, shitstorm of drama surrounding this resurrection. They have no fantasy RPG coming out. There's like a sci-fi kind of futuristic RPG that they're making their initial run, and that looks fine. And the designer is a good RPG designer. But the issue is that there's a whole legacy of uncomfortableness surrounding uncomfortability surrounding Gary Gygax, his relationship to his wives, his relationship to his daughters, who owns the rights of the company, who actually contributed the most to the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. Is he kind of like Stan Lee, and Stan Lee being like, yeah, I created all these heroes, whereas it's like maybe it was a little bit more collaborative with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko than you were giving some initial impression on. Or getting back to like Macintosh or any of those kind of things. But nonetheless, the big claim of this new TSR was like, we're making games great again. We're bringing it back to the old days. The old days when D&D was awesome, or RPGs were awesome. And in 2021, that sort of sentiment, especially after 4 years of making things great again, it's met with some skepticism. And it seems like some of the creators have made some comments in the past about the LGBTQ community, given some sort of signs that they'd be less than welcoming to certain creators working for them, or for, like RPGs are meant for this group of people.
Right.
And I think that creates drama in general, nonetheless. And the biggest thing is that their reaction was to double down, which
isn't that always the case though?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, tell me I'm wrong here, but isn't that what you usually see from that old mindset of, well, we need to revive a thing because the world is missing this thing that was great 30, 40, 50 years ago, however long ago, and we need to revive it. We need to, because what's out here now is garbage. We need to make it great again.
Exactly.
And whenever they're confronted on this idea of like, well, but don't you think that there were some problematic things that immediately it's like prying open the shell. If they had just never been asked a question, if you never asked these guys these questions, then you'd never know just how deep it runs if all you had to go on was their product. But as soon as you start questioning them and they start actually having to defend themselves, it opens up and you realize, oh man, they have some backwards ideas.
Yeah. I put it in Discord, but they had some pretty crazy tweets on the new TSR account. Like one of them was essentially saying something like it was along the lines of blaming Dungeons and Dragons for steering to, or blaming RPGs for steering too close to their suburban roots, is like blaming the trombone for being too German, talking about like polka music and that kind of stuff. And it just seemed so tone deaf as to being like, hey, we're just a bunch of white geeks hanging out with our guy friends, and that's what we want to have. And hey, we just want to have a good time, and don't blame us for that. In the face of people being like, is this legitimately different than how you as individuals have portrayed yourselves in the past and how this company was. Because when when they're talking about going back to the glory days of Dungeons and Dragons and RPGs, and they do, talk a lot about Dungeons and Dragons, they're not distancing themselves from it. It's they're talking about going back to days in which it was a much more exclusive environment that was not particularly welcoming, in which it was a community driven by white males in suburban neighborhoods, whereas Dungeons and Dragons now, especially since 5th edition, has become this prolific thing that has so many different creative individuals, and anyone can be anyone within the scope of D&D or RPGs in general. And I think people thinking, that they're talking about the glory days of this whole business just kind of leaves a bad taste in their mouths.
It's got a lot of, I think we could leave it off by saying, it's got a lot of greatest generation nostalgia, golden haze sort of nostalgia, where all you see is, well, the world banded together to defend ourselves from World War II, and that was a time when Americans knew how to do a hard day's work. And it sounds good when you have someone talking about that, and then you're like, yeah, except that like half the population couldn't vote, and
right.
And you just start listening. So it's like you pick one thing to say, well, it was good because. And you just want to exclude it, but you can't put it in a vacuum. And I think anybody with that mindset of we have to go back to make something better isn't looking forward. D&D is as good as it's ever been and better. It's as inclusive as it's ever been and 10 times more so. And it always has room to grow in that area. And that's a very divisive statement right there. Some people would say it hasn't done enough. And I would say, it's getting there, hopefully.
Right.
And it's come a long, long way from where it was. And I think it's better for it. And
yeah. It's still honestly, a game. I don't have to deal with THAC0 anymore. Like, who wants to go back to the glory days of THAC0, John?
Yeah, we're not going back to when you had to multi-class to 3 different classes just to become a bard, which you didn't want to be anyway.
Right, so, exactly. Well, the reason why it was most interesting to me, and I think this may be, a topic for another day to dive into, but recently I've been thinking a lot about death of the author as a concept, especially with all the controversy going on with like J.K. Rowling. And then also, I've thought about this a lot with Orson Scott Card and the Ender series, where, like, how much should we as consumers of media divorce ourselves from the creative individuals who made them and what we know about them, as well as their authorial intent. And board games are a different beast. It's not the same thing as a book or a movie or a song, but it's still a creative work. And, especially if they're living creators who you are enabling to continue to have a platform, there's an argument to be made that you should be more conscientious about the creators, but there's also just as much of an argument to be made to say divorce yourself entirely from it. But I think that's an argument for another day.
That is Pandora's box of talk show topics there. Also, I'm just going to make a strong recommendation. Don't take on the Potterheads. Okay, J.K. Rowling is a divisive figure, but I'm making no statements about that because there's too many Harry Potter fans out there. I don't want to come down on any side of that fence because there's no winning.
Right. As long as we can agree that Snape was blameless. So, John, expansions. From the time that you and I have really been in the modern hobby gaming, expansions have been somewhat prolific, but they have only become more and more ubiquitous as, the last decade has gone on. And I've been thinking a lot about this more because, when I first started getting into games, I wanted every expansion because initially I thought of them as extremely special. And if I liked a game good enough in order to buy a game, well, why not get the expansion, right?
And let me ask you a question. Like, what's your history on computer gaming? Because to me, when I went into expansions, I was in my early adulthood, was more of a PC gamer. And often to me, and this was before the era of DLC video game content. So it was, to me, an expansion was, Diablo 2
Lord of Destruction. Is that what we're talking?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was getting, you get your $40 or $50, PC game, whatever the price was at that time, and then you get your like your 20, 25, $30 expansion that comes on and bolts on like another 30% more content or something. And it was getting to live more in this universe you were already just dying to get more of. And you couldn't wait for, Diablo 3. You had to get more of Diablo 2 now, and so it was easy to translate that to board games and just go crazy. Buying expansions is like, well, I love this board game, so I'm just gonna expansions, man. Got to get more of it. With no real thought about what was I expanding, what was the virtue, why should I own it, and all of those things, which we're now sort of reflecting on.
When was the first time that you heard about board game expansions? Because for me, it was really early on. My brother kind of blew my mind because Hero Quest, even way back in the day, had expansions, and now they're worth like gajillions of dollars, far more than the actual base game copy of Hero Quest is. But I thought that was like such a novelty and a one-off thing. I didn't realize that it had persisted into other modern hobby games. And I guess you could argue that Magic the Gathering kind of built itself upon expansions. Dungeons and Dragons built itself upon expansions.
But that'll kind of get into if we talk about like what the virtues of different expansions are and what they bring to the table. That kind of gets into like, I almost don't even think of those as expansions because it's part of the business model of the game. The game is an expanding, living thing. Whereas you think of a board game, if you take Risk off the shelf or whatever, or maybe long time ago, if you take Catan off the shelf, it was just this limited experience. Right. And I think that I didn't even, I think Catan was one of the early ones for me too, where I was like, oh my God, there's all these different. These aren't variants. These are additional mechanics to attach to the original game.
And you got to get them all. Let's get Seafarers in here. Let's get Cities and Knights in here. And suddenly the box doesn't contain it all. And you're like, I don't even like playing Catan anymore.
Wait, and let's get Catan. And then I got to make sure I have enough for 5 to 6 players. But then if I get Cities and Knights, I also have to get 5 to 6 player expansion for that.
Yeah.
So like there was a lot of that early on. I didn't get too crazy on that one, but that was an early example of like, man, this is a whole side industry of expanding my board games.
So maybe not, not something that you view as like monumental now, but like, can you think of a game where the expansion genuinely took the game to another level? Like, and you could see that in real time, not just like Catan and adding more stuff into it, but like where you opened up this expansion, you're like, this took an okay game or a good game, and this made it so much better. And you got that feeling of completion from it.
If I had to, the one that jumps to my mind, if I had to go back to it, was BSG's. I really think the Pegasus expansion did a lot for it, and which is funny because I also would list the BSG expansions on my list of some of the don'ts in expansion phase. But some of what it did it so well. That specifically the treachery cards. Giving trader players ways to interact with the game system other than just passively sinking these checks. You had a way to really participate and feel like you're I'm cutting wires in machines, I'm throwing wrenches into the works, and,
right.
And that was something that like instantly it was an auto include for me.
Yeah, we can get into this in a little bit here, but I think what's interesting about that expansion, as you call it out, is it's one of those modular expansions, which I think were more popular 5 to 10 years ago, when it was just kind of like, let's throw everything, including the kitchen sink, into this box. And if people want to use it, they can use it. But for me, that oftentimes represents like,
that's why it's on the don'ts.
This is 4 things I don't like and 1 that I love, and so I have a lot of unplayed with toys in the box, which is a bummer, to say the least, when you have that going on. But the reason why I wanted to talk about expansions, I keep on looking up over here for the people watching the video.
Which one are you looking at right now?
I'm not actually looking at any expansion. I just tend to, muse while looking in a general upward direction. So a little quirk about me. You're getting a little bit of the flavor when you're on the actual live chat here. But the reason why I wanted to talk about expansions is the question, are expansions good? Initially, I had it as, are expansions bad? And I realized, you know what? That's a terrible question, because I have an easy.
That's an obvious answer. No, they're not. They're not bad.
Right. But I think it's a lot more thought-provoking and interesting to ask, are they good? Like, is it good for us as gamers? Is it good for this industry, that we've evolved to? Games are essentially designed as platforms in order to serve subsequent expansions. I know that on an interview that I did with Cole Worley and Patrick Leader, for the upcoming release of Oath a while ago, Cole Worley actually was like, I know I do expansions, I have these root expansions I'm working on, but in truth, I don't really like expansions. I don't like the idea of games running in perpetuity. And so I only want to add something to a game if it feels truly meaningful. Otherwise, I would rather just work on an entirely new game. And I was like, I can get behind that. So when I ask the question to you, are expansions good? What does that bring to mind for you?
So I guess the question is, it's like it's a deeper question than just, is it good? Is it good for who exactly, or whom?
Right,
Um,
right.
For whom is it good for?
For whom does the expansion toll?
I think that's part of the question you're asking is it good for the industry? Well, I mean, anything that makes the industry money makes it healthier, right?
Sure, sure.
But I imagine that for producers, there's a lot of risk in expansion. So, that's its own question that I don't maybe have all the information on. But I would generally think that it's a sign of health in a game. If it has a good following, it tends to get an expansion. So in that regards, maybe, yeah, it's good for the industry. Is it good for us as consumers? This goes back to the purge topic of, do we need to own everything that's out there? And
Right.
just like individual board games, no, I don't think we need to own every expansion. And that gets into really, like, when is an expansion good? When is it good? And that's really what you're asking at the end of the day, I think, is like, when is an expansion a necessary or vital part of a game? Maybe necessary may be an exaggeration. I think if it's necessary, then you've done something wrong designing the game in the first place.
So when you're checking out Kickstarter for the new hot takes, the things that are going up there, the things that are preying on your FOMO, and it says, like, also you can pay $25 to get the day one expansion add-on. Does that make you skeptical of the completion of the original game? Like, maybe they designed a complete game and then removed a section from it. One of probably my favorite game, Spirit
DLC
Island.
Moment right there.
Yeah, Spirit Island, I know for fact, was designed. R. Eric Royce designed the game to include the branch and claw stuff. And then through iteration and talking with Greater Than Games, they decided, you know what, the event card thing is maybe a new level of complexity. Let's remove that whole thing and have the two factions that are going to interact with a lot of the stuff that the event cards are going to interact with, and make that the branch and claw expansion, and then kickstart that all at once. If people want the higher level thing, they can get it. Otherwise, it's just going to be the base game without it. And I don't know, like, that, to me, I always feel like there's something missing in that I'm not getting the complete thing if from the get-go there's separate material that's being announced. But that may be
like Skyrim Horse Armor.
Fuddy-duddy. Yeah. Well, I mean,
why
don't go comparing Spirit Island to Skyrim Horse Armor here.
Branch and claws and horse armor. But it's that same idea of, like, I remember that was the, or was it even Skyrim? No, I'm thinking Oblivion, actually, aren't I?
Yeah. Actually, you are. Way back in the day.
Horse Armor. Yeah, I got to go back another generation of that game. So, but the point of that was, I'm not getting very much, and it should have just been a part of the game, or at least that was the outrage, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So there was both a value argument, it's cosmetic only, but also well, why did you just take this out?
Right.
So I would say a couple of things about that. There's two sides of that. There's the consumer side and the business side. On the business side, maybe it does make sense. Maybe it makes sense in some cases where, I don't know, let's say you have a game that would otherwise, you'd be, due to the economics of board game production, you'd have to retail it at $80. Okay. as your MSRP. And maybe that somebody's done some research out there, like what's the tipping point for a certain middle weight of game, and $80 is maybe just not like platinum selling material, right? That's more elite says you need to have a name to sell an $80 game. So maybe you want to get in that price point, like that target price point. You want to be at $40 or $50. And so maybe by shaving off components, you can do that. And if you can do that organically, well, then maybe that makes sense to sell sort of a budget version of your game. And honestly, that could be a good thing for the consumer too, because if you're someone who has a large collection, maybe you don't need the exhaustive material. Maybe a $40 copy to dip your toe in is better than that $80. That's devil's advocate. Let's assume that's the motivation, some of it there. But then there's the other side of the coin, which, okay, now I really am the devil here, is it's more the FOMO. It is a tactic.
Totally.
Because tons of research has been done at this point in Kickstarter. And one of the things that they have to do is they have to have a big day one launch. They have to be able to put up that sign that says funded in 16 minutes, or 300% funded. That is a gotta do if you're going to hit that like $1 million plus Kickstarter. But then the other thing they have to do is you can't taper off. So you have to have, we're not even going to put all the add-ons on the screen day one. We're going to get everybody to back at day one. Then we're going to tell you about an expansion that will come with the game when you get it, that day one expansion. But we're not even going to tell you about it until halfway into the campaign, because we need that extra surge of, oh, look, we just went from 1 million to 1.8 million. And now even more people are going to back it because it's like, oh God, it's generating even more hype. That's more clicks. That's more talks. It's more comments on BGG. And suddenly it's at number one on the hotness. And you've got to keep the hype high for that full 28-day, campaign.
Yeah, I think that's a total play right out of the CMON playbook, is to have hidden stretch goals and everything where you don't even announce what the dollar value to reach the next stretch goal is until after the last one was reached. So that way they can anticipate like what is the exact level we need to announce this at in order to continue drive while ensuring that it's going to be successful at the schedule that we have for it. So they can fluctuate all those things as they go.
And the way you get to that next level is by releasing, it's not just by getting new backers. There's this argument that, well, if I'm backing it for $40 and all of a sudden there's a stretch goal out there because you hit this $1.2 million mark, well, maybe it's worth $40 to me now. Well, that's probably, they probably get new backers when they release those stretch goals. But the reality is when they release the stretch goals and then they offer an opportunity to unlock an add-on, for example, like, okay, well, we're at stretch goal 1.2 million, and to get to 1.8, hey, guess what? We're going to sneak this add-on out there. All of the existing backers are now going to immediately get the add-on, and then that stretch goal for 1.8 million is met, So they give you a way to spend the money to get to the next goal, and it just feeds the cycle. And I think in those cases, you could argue that the expansion becomes questionable. It adds, maybe the expansion is still good, but it still makes it questionable. You make the motivation suspect.
Yeah, Lewis in the live chat here actually calls out the game that I was exactly thinking of, because you and I were talking about Marvel Champions, or not Marvel Champions, Marvel United recently as a CMON game, and how much has been packed into that Kickstarter. And yeah, that is exactly the model that I was talking about. Speaking of live chat, Amelia has a really good question here. Being unsure of what should expansions do, like, what's the intent of them coming out aside from make more money for the publishers? Should they fix the game? Should they be kind of like the next step to the new version of the game, essentially taking it to a new edition if you include the expansion? Or should they add gameplay, like fully introduce new elements? I think different situations call for different things. I mean, some of the best expansions like come to my mind, some of my favorite ones are ones like Scoundrels' Skullport for Lords of Waterdeep, which is one that actually introduces a whole new mechanic to the game, particularly the Skullport corruption mechanic. And I think that is a fundamentally different and more interesting version of that game, just like Tuscany for viticulture makes it a fundamentally different and much more interesting game without having to revise all kinds of things from the original set. But I don't know, like, are you so purposeful when you think about expansions? Like, what goes into your decisions when you're thinking about buying new expansions, John?
Well, a lot of it goes into I this far down the road. You might not think of it when you're building your collection as much, but I start to think about like how I would classify what an expansion does. And I look, you're not always going to know when you're reading reviews or you're looking at a Kickstarter, especially. You're not always going to know, but you try to look for the elements that give you clues about this. So let's assume that I can gather some of this information. I look for what does an expansion do for the game.
Right.
If I don't already, or if I already own the game and I think it's a good game, that eliminates that question of does it fix it. So because I did notice Emily asked that, do I get an expansion that fixes a game? Well, I would argue that if you already own the game and you really want it to be good, well, of course, I would say yes, get the one that fixes it. If you're thinking of investing in the game for the first time and it requires an expansion to really quote unquote fix the game,
yeah.
well, then you need to question whether the game is there a better value game out there that doesn't need fixing from day one?
Yeah.
But that is kind of the negative side of it. So let's think about like what expansions do I want? Couple of good examples are things that add variety without adding complexity. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Factions are a good example. Marvel Champions is a great example of a type of thing, or any of those types where they add, I can play a new character. Well, it's the same rules. Now I've just got something interesting to play with here. Anything that adds, though, deck building and army building components, it's like the Magic the Gathering collection really have to be invested in that game. So, that may not be an opportunity to get into variety.
Yeah. Well, I think great examples of this, Spirit Island introduced tons of new variety to the game through new spirits being released either as promo packs or full-on expansions. You have Root, which fundamentally the game hasn't changed at all, but they've introduced through expansions new factions as well as like interchangeable maps. So like the environment that you're playing is different, but the fundamental mechanics of the game remains constant.
Well, and those would be on my list of a couple of the top tier variety without necessarily adding extreme complexity. Komet was another one that I would call out, as they have one of their original, the first edition, the Black Pyramids expansion, specifically the Black Pyramids portion of that was tacking on this new set of powers, but not changing the rules of really how you utilize those things. And that it introduced what I think was probably the best state of play, having 4 options to select from so that not everybody would always pick the same 3. And so that is an automatic include because of the kind of variety it adds. On the other hand, and to chime off on what you said, Spirit Island, that's great variety because the spirits, again, they add an interesting way to play, but they don't change the rules at all.
Right. Aside from the other stuff that came out with the expansion, like the event cards and everything like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So can you think of a game where, you mentioned earlier, if you already had the game, then you would be tempted to buy an expansion that essentially like fixes it for you or keeps it in your collection. Are there any that you've actually done that with?
To quote unquote fix a game?
Yeah, to make the game, maybe it's not like a bad game, but it's a game that if you didn't have the expansion, that it would be one that you'd get rid of. But getting the expansion makes it something that it'd be worth keeping this around. I would argue if you're on the verge of getting rid of a game, like it's out the door, then don't have that sunken cost fallacy of you're suddenly going to like a game so much that a game that you would normally get rid of, that you're now going to like it. I mean, I can see the argument that, Tuscany, or I mentioned earlier, for a lot of people makes viticulture, instead of a great game, it's suddenly like an excellent game. But if you're going like, man, I just am not feeling the vibe of, I don't know, let's say Flamme Rouge. It's just not the game that you're loving. Don't look at an expansion to solve that for you. At that point, if you're wanting it to change to a fundamentally different game and you're hoping that an expansion is going to do that for you, probably the more sure bet is to get another game, which will be a fundamentally different game, and then wipe your hands clean. Don't invest more money in games that you don't like.
And I would say the same thing, because I don't think I've ever had a game in my collection where it was so close to the threshold of I don't want to keep this game.
Hmm.
Because if it gets to that close to the threshold where only an expansion can save it, then it's probably already gone.
Right.
So for me, I would say I'm on the opposite side, where I already really enjoy the game, or enjoy it quite a bit, enough to keep it in the collection, and an expansion is an automatic include in the game
Hmm.
because it elevates the game to great. But I wouldn't get rid of the game without it. I still wouldn't play it without the expansion. And a great example for me is, and there's certain assumption here. I'll just make this caveat up front, is that we're assuming that you've played the game once, maybe, and because some of these, you need a certain
Right.
level of familiarity. I would always include the Prelude expansion for Terraforming Mars every time I play it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, I might not always include that with a brand new player, because I mean, there's something to be said for choosing the beginner corporation and just keeping it simple. But the second time they play, every single time I'm going to break out Prelude, and because that to me elevates the game, what is already a really good game, to a great game, just by enhancing the types of decisions you get to make, without adding complexity about what those decisions mean as far as building new systems.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
that's a
totally.
great example of a modular expansion that you can bolt on, integrating it seamlessly without building a side mini game. By comparison, I'm pretty meh on the other three expansions. So
Yeah,
the
they
mini
they kind of sit gathering dust in the box for me.
they're mini
Occasionally,
games.
I'll break out one, but the way I've always described it is, to me, they make the game wider without making the game any deeper. Like there's nothing to me that Turmoil, or the Colonies expansion, or even the Venus Next expansion, nothing about it makes it a richer experience. It makes it a bigger experience, and I guess that can be interesting. I saw
If
at
what you want is
Platypus
bigger.
Con. I saw at Platypus Con someone playing with every Terraforming Mars expansion last time I was there, and that kind of blew my mind. That someone would say, what would be great is a 5-player all expansions game of Terraforming Mars. But yeah, they don't really make the game fundamentally more interesting to me. And I think the game already has a level of complexity that adding into that complexity without giving you like avenues to channel that back into the core experience detracts from the game. It actually makes it a worse experience for me to play with those expansions in some cases, especially when it's more than one of those.
Right, and if when it tacks on that side game where it's just like, well, now, basically, if you ever find yourself feeling like I'm playing the main game over here, but now what this expansion does is it gives me this little sideboard to like keep track of and remember off in the corner, that is a good sign that it's probably just bolting on something it didn't need. And to me, it's like, there's a certain point. You look, Coke is great, but if you add cherry, look, it's cherry Coke, and that's great too. But then if you start to add too many other flavors, you just if I add lemon lime, then I'm just gonna ask myself, well, that's first of all, that's kind of gross. Second of all, unless you're a kid and you're just running down the soda aisle at like
You got to have that
7-Eleven.
suicide, John. Yeah, you got to have every single flavor. That was
Well,
every time I went to Costco with my dad and I'd get a hot dog and I'd be like, I'm getting every single one of these, including Diet Coke. I don't know why I added Diet Coke to that, but it was part of the melange.
exactly. That's the only time it's acceptable though, because otherwise I just look at this and go, just drink a Sprite if you really want lemon lime so bad. And that's exactly it though. That's my analogy. Is sometimes when you look at a board game, you just go like, I am not so desperate to be playing Terraforming Mars that I want to tack on a game that involves deck building or something. So, if I want a mechanic that isn't in the base game and it doesn't lend itself to the nature of what the game is already, and it just adds a mini game on the side, then I'm just gonna maybe just place. That's why I have more board games. That's why I have more than one. If I could only ever own one game, well, sure, just keep adding expansions to it. But I'm never gonna play enough of any one board game to deserve getting bored with
Yeah. There are some games where like, they're not necessarily fixing the game, but they are kind of paying attention to, like, the creators are paying attention to some of the feedback to the original game. And I think this came up by Lewis in the live chat again earlier. And one that I can think of, for example, is Tapestry. Tapestry came out with the PP expansion. I don't know why they decided Plans Employees was the way to go, and they print PP on every single one of their cards. But hey, Stonemaier,
it. We're all
they
12
do
at
them
heart. That's why.
exactly. But One, they had some balance changes in the expansion, but they also introduced some things that were intended to kind of address some of the feedback. Tapestry was a bit of a controversial game. I liked it, but I also recognize a lot of the problems with it. So I didn't necessarily see that as like fixing the game, but I did appreciate that the expansion, was trying to take into consideration some of these things to make it, go from a game that people think is like, it's good, but it's got some hinkiness to it, to this is more of what the original pitch was, and maybe a more balanced and cohesive game. So it is nice when there is some development on that kind of stuff. But we've talked about a few different specific expansions here. You mentioned always include expansions like Prelude. What about what are some of the expansions that you treasure at this point? The ones that really fleshed out the games that you already love best and give you more of what you want.
Well, okay, so I'm just gonna get this one out of the way because it's an eye roll. I am a big fan of Cthulhu Wars.
Right.
It's
my indulgent.
It is. At this point, I'm just like, I want to dump it all in a pile.
Right.
Roll around it like Scrooge McDuck. Okay, and there's enough of it at this point to do that. So
we're going to need that image for the Discord channel later.
I'm gonna get I took some pictures of it. I had that moment. I did not swan dive into it like a duck that doesn't wear pants. I did put it all on the table behind me though, just to see it all out of the box at once. And I will put those pictures up on Discord because it is obscene. But the cool thing about that is it's like Root. It's asymmetric, right? It's faction based, and that is what I love about the expansions, is that so much of it is. It's all the same core gameplay mechanics. Almost none of it adds any new mechanics other than the specific rules about what your faction does, But Totally. It's all still pay power to do this, take your turn like this. And so you can include any one of them you want. You can play as the bird people, the cat people, you can play as the vagabond. And it all feels good to just have that toolbox of fun. So setting that one aside though, because that to me is almost not even an expansion. That's just like adding factions to something. Looking at some of the real expansions, I loved Black Pyramids of Kemet. However, I did not like its original implementation where it tacked on a mini game, and so you got that board game box that had the thing you love and the thing you hate, right? And some of it collected dust. I love the second edition for including the Black Pyramids right out of the gate, because clearly, and it's a trend of second editions picking up the best of the expansions, or the Essential Edition, the Tuscany Essential Edition type. Or the viticulture, rather. Sorry.
Right.
I would also throw in there the Spirit Island expansions, Prelude. We've covered a couple of them in particular. I think I have a really passionate love for the Game of Thrones expansion.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to bring up Game of Thrones. Which expansion were you going to bring up?
Mother of Dragons.
Okay, yeah. So Mother of Dragons is an interesting expansion because it's one, I actually haven't played Mother of Dragons yet. I own Mother of Dragons, and it's one of those ones where it demonstrates even my susceptibility to this like fear of missing out. That's even in retail. This wasn't a Kickstarter game or anything, but I realized, I think early pandemic, this expansion came out and it kind of fundamentally changes one of my favorite games of all time. And I don't want it to sell poorly and to have Fantasy Flight just like can their whole infrastructure when it comes to the Game of Thrones franchise, especially after season 8 and all of that debacle. And so I don't even know when the next time I'm going to be able to play this, let alone play games with anyone who doesn't live in my household. So I'm going to buy this thing, and I still haven't played it, but it is sitting around in a box. And I think that to me represents this whole weird feeling that I have towards expansions, like this this necessity to complete the things that I own and love. And as much as I try to mature and separate myself from this idea of I need to have everything associated with the things I love, like toys and bikes and comic books and, books and board games, that's still a part of me. And I still have this, gut reaction of I better pick it up, even if I don't know that it's going to make the game better, even if I don't know that I'm going to play it. Game of Thrones is in a unique place because it's a franchise that I hold really dear. I have a lot of great memories in playing it with you and our game group. And it's a game that I don't think is going to leave my collection anytime soon. But nonetheless, I have a degree of resentment in me towards me and what that expansion represents, that I gotta get it. I gotta get it. I gotta get it and put it in the box and never play with it.
And I'll be honest, I actually brought that one up because I was kind of hoping that you would say that, because that is my feeling about it too. I may never play Mother of Dragons enough to justify buying it. I might get it played a couple times in my life for all I know.
Right.
But it's one of those rare times where I actually gave myself permission, because this far down the road, I absolutely am of that mindset that you are, where it's like, I've let go of the idea that I need to have 100% of every game I own. I don't. I need to have 100% of the things that bring the best value. And to me, this one may not be a value proposition because it costs X amount of dollars and it takes up X amount of space, and it may never get played to the degree that justifies those things. But I do care about this game enough that I actually take pleasure in just owning the complete set of this thing. It's one of the rare times I give myself permission. That's why I wanted to bring that up, because I don't do that anymore for games. And my big example is the Seven Wonders was one of the games I added to my collection early on. And that was actually one of the games that I originally started expanding immediately. As soon as they came out with expansions, it's like, well, okay, I'll add cities, and I'll add the leaders, and then Babel, that's got a whole.
It's got the whole card, so you got the whole like 8.5 by 11 cards. Sheets of paper.
And I build a tower, kind of. I mean, it's a very flat tower, but it's a tower.
There's dimension to it,
right? So it adds all this stuff. I don't think I've ever played. And I definitely, when I saw Armada came out, I mean, that was a couple years ago now. God, maybe even like 4 or 5. And when that was coming out, my first reaction was, ooh, another expansion to a game I own. And reality kicked in pretty quickly after that, where it's just like, yeah, except I didn't play the last expansion. And I don't often play leaders and cities. In fact, I really break out Seven Wonders as kind of one of my entry games to get people into gaming and stuff, because it's a great game and I can just play the base game, and that gives me what I like about Seven Wonders without needing all this extra stuff.
Right.
If I were someone who owned 10 board games and those were the only 10 games I owned, and I played Seven Wonders to death, I might own all the expansions. But I could probably give away all 3 of the expansions I own now and not regret that. And so I did not buy Armada as a result of that. And I still have the other 3, but you get the idea. Is it very much, that's the opposite of Game of Thrones, where I don't give myself permission to buy that because it doesn't hold that special place. And so I need to get value out of it, and I'm not gonna.
I think that's all it comes down to is, are you going to get value out of it? I mean, like I really love a lot of the expansions to older games that introduce solo modes that weren't originally available. Like that's really cool to me. Castles of Burgundy has a fantastic solo mode that required some additional materials. Now it's packed in with the new edition of the game, but for a while it was only available as one of their mini expansions. The Between Two Castles, Mad King Ludwig originally didn't have a solo mode, and the new expansion adds a bunch of cool new stuff for multiplayer, but it adds just a little bit of material in there that makes it a fully functioning solitaire game, which is banging. I love it. It's a really good solitaire game. So I'm always pleased to see when a game expansion adds more function to it, and that's meaningful if you're going to get value out of it. So really your answer is perfect. Are you going to get value out of it?
Be as critical as you would be with buying a new game in the first place. Don't let your love of the base game overshadow your good sense when it comes to adding another thing, because it's just as bad as adding new games.
Totally. My takeaway from it at this point of, are expansions good? Answering the original question, um, you know, they do allow for a healthier industry, and I appreciate that. And because Kickstarter has become such an important cornerstone of our industry, and you could argue that it's been somewhat corrupted by these larger corporations coming in and kickstarting games that they don't need the Kickstarter mechanism in order to get these games made. But there are nonetheless a lot of companies out there that are smaller game companies that are still able to crowdfund games, get them made, and expansions are part of that infrastructure. If it empowers them in order to get the metrics they need to get games made, then more power to it. A game that I love that was a Kickstarter game from a very small company is Adventure Tactics. I've been kind of really jamming on that lately, and if they needed expansions to be part of that original Kickstarter in order to make it viable, and that was the only way that they were going to get that game made, then hey, I can deal with that. And it does give more flexibility for us as consumers. I think just like the Purge conversation, like you and I as old men gamers sitting in the back being like, listen here, young one, our wisdom to impart is don't feel like you have to complete everything. Not every expansion is going to be good, and vote with your dollars. If you don't like day one expansions coming out, then don't support them. So long as they're being sold, so long as people are getting them, then people are going to keep on making them. I am dubious as to the nature of expansions at this point. I feel like more and more board games have become platforms for expansions, and
Franchising.
yeah, exactly. Companies are coming up with new board games and saying, what is the potential that I have for expansions when I sign this game? Designer, you're pitching a game to me. Great. Now tell me how many expansion ideas you have in mind, so that way we can continue to support this game with annual or biannual expansions to come out in order to make this a viable line. So there is a degree of cynicism in me towards the ubiquity of expansions, but probably the biggest point in favor of expansions to me is, um, as I've gotten deeper into the hobby, I found myself more and more longing for more intimacy with the games that I love the most, rather than playing as many games as I possibly can. So if expansions give me more legs to the games that I love, and give me more options with the games that I love, and I can have a smaller but deeper and richer collection of games, then I'm totally in favor of that. But then we have the terraforming Mars problem.
Right. And that I would just agree with you on that is just and I see some of the comments out there about the day one expansions out in chat, and I got to agree. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I try to assume that there's, I look at a company and I know that they're in their own best interest, right? But they're also making a game, and hopefully there's a certain amount of passion that goes into that they want to make a good game. They're not just trying to make a dollar. They're also hoping to make a good product. So I do hope that that's the case, but I am very critical of day one expansions. They're not always bad. Sometimes they make practical sense. Sometimes they're things I want to buy. But because that the fear of missing out is such a powerful thing, and that they're trying to sell you on that, you need to be extra critical of those. And expansions as a whole, I think, deserve maybe a little bit more of a critical eye than just buying new board games in some respects. But when they are good, they can be better in some ways, like you said, than buying a new board game. It can bring you closer to the game you really love. As I look over your shoulder and see Wingspan right behind you there.
Yeah, I gotta have it all over here. But those came out subsequently. Those came out, and those are good expansions. I do think being critical of it is important. Actually, on the Cardboard Herald, I don't know if you've heard of this channel, but on the Cardboard Herald, that schmuck was reviewing some games recently, including Veil Wraith, which is a solitaire focused game. And the chief criticism of the game was that the box has it's such a great infrastructure and such a great system, but the initial offering is so slim, and there was a simultaneously released expansion, which I'm going to get and I'm going to review, but I don't have it right now, and it kind of makes the game seem flimsy, and like this all should have been included as part of the whole shebang. But again, the Kickstarter tactics need to capitalize on separate releases, and to me, I think that that's an example of where you should be critical of this. It feels nefarious when you buy a retail game and it looks like there's a big gaping hole in it because the content was migrated over to an expansion. And then Adventure Tactics. I mean, I was going to end this by asking what the last expansion that you bought was. I brought up that I really like Adventure Tactics. In the back of the rule book, in the job class book, which that's one of the main features of the game, is there's all these different job classes that you can level up into, and that's great. But the job classes at the back say, if you have the hero pack 1, and then you can also level up into these 3 job classes. And I was like, oh, I want to level up into those. And so I ordered it, which I don't feel like the base game is necessarily lacking for content in that regard. But it does feel, it feels gross, I think, when you're referencing your expansion content in the base game itself.
Yeah, well, I'm Comet 2.0, Comet Blood and Sand. I was a little perplexed at first because I was looking at one of the boards, and as I'm going through, I'm packaging everything, and I'm going, oh, okay, take it all out, pump it, pop it all out, and bag everything up. The best part of buying a board game, right? The sorting and the sifting through all the pieces. I noticed that on the player board, on one of the player boards, it indicated a symbol for like a 7. There was a 6th symbol there for a player icon. And I'm like, what the hell is this? And so I went back through all my pieces. I'm like, okay, well, we've got red, blue, green, black, and beige. And who's this other dude? And it's small enough that maybe I'm misreading it. So then I flip through and I find the thing where it says, oh, there's an expand. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't feel like anything is missing from this box, so I don't begrudge it at all. But there is something about having pre-planned expansion components where you just look at that and go, wait a minute, have I been tricked? Whereas, on the other hand, I would complain just as much. I'm just going to put it out there. In all fairness, board game designers, I would complain just as much if I had this awesome player board or reference board or whatever the board happens to be, and your expansion requires me to tack on like a little mini board. I just set it next to it. I always hated those. So I like having it all on one piece. Just,
right.
I know, part of me, it feels like, damn it, now I have to buy it because now I've got it. It's referenced on the game pieces.
Exactly. Well, I guess, we talked about like more stuff, expansions being, adding more variety, and, like, I guess there is an opportunity there for a company to say, we made an available, affordable version of this game, and if you want more, it's out there. We're trying to not overcharge you for that.
That was my 4080 MSRP arguments. That maybe there's a better price point to bring it in at.
Totally. And I think, like, I don't know. I think that one thing that we haven't necessarily mentioned is that whether it's showing off to other people, like introducing a new game, expansions can be intimidating. You did bring that up earlier in the context of like terraforming Mars and that kind of stuff. But also for me, when you have a collection of 50 to 100 games and you're playing all these different games and everything, and you haven't dusted off a copy of something in, say, a year, and you pull it out and you're like, oh, we can play with all the expansion. And then you look at the rule books and you're like, you know what, let's just play base game. I don't want to relearn these expansions in order to play this game the once per year in which I'm playing it. I got that feeling with BSG sometimes. Like some of the stuff was very easy to integrate, and then some of the stuff was much more niche. It was like learning ports in the Game of Thrones board game. I know that wasn't expansions, but there is a lot of, uh, esoteric stuff that sometimes is tucked away in expansions, and it adds a level of complexity and a barrier to getting it to the table because you have to relearn this stuff, which isn't fundamental to the core structure of the game. And so I think that they can, in some cases, become deterrents to you playing your own games, which I think is the argument for the more stuff expansion, stuff that just seamlessly integrates into the existing infrastructure.
Which I saw a couple comments in chat about that too. Is that couple points out? Musar523 points out that the day one expansions benefiting if the game is heavier, that maybe breaking it into an expansion, if you're not inclined to dive into it that deeply, then maybe it sets aside some of the heavier stuff out there. Uncle Fester brought up a good counterpoint, actually made his own point and counterpoint.
Yeah, that's a very John move right there.
Yeah, I was like, I hate day one expansions. But here's the exception. But it was a good exception, is that, modularity, again, the creation of variety without complexity, where you're not really changing the base mechanics. So you can just, okay, this time we're going to play with this group and this time we're going to play with this group. That's great. Tyrants of the Underdark is a game that just got a second edition that is incorporating that. The first edition had 4, my memory's blanking, and it's on my shelf. I should know this. I think it had 4.
I think you're the only person who ever played Tyrants of Underdark, John. I hate to tell you this, but
not true. It's the second best D&D board game out there, next to Lords of Waterdeep. However, it came with these 4 faction decks, and you'd mix up 2 and you'd play the game, right? Well, and then one of the expansions was like a $15 pack or something like that. It had 2 more. And it's such an obvious, well, duh. I mean, that's an easy thing to include, because when I opened the game, I just picked 2, mash them together, and that's the deck that you play with for the game.
Right.
Well, having 2 more just increases the interest level without increasing any of the rules.
Totally.
So yeah, great option. But I just will say that it's the same feeling at the Shelf of Shame. Well, I have the hidden shame on top of that, of opening a board game that I know that I can get the base game played, but I look into the side of it here and there's some expansion material off the side that I'm never going to get played, because I'd have to get this game to the table 2 or 3 times in a row to get my group familiar enough again, to get them all back in the swing, to get the expansion played finally.
Right.
And
so then like we have to get the list of the board games that we need to play in order to get all the expansions on the table. And then I think you and we've already done on this channel, or I've already done on this channel, like a best expansions list. But I think we need to specifically highlight in some sort of video, like just run down the list of expansions that made big impacts on the games, or like a good and bad examples, like that would be really interesting. Like, here's our top 10 best and worst expansions. I think that would be a fantastic video, and we'd have a lot of good discussion and deliberation on that. But I think we could talk about expansions forever. I think we could talk about games forever, which is why we're doing this whole thing. But we will save some of that chat for next time. For now, what's the most recent expansion that you bought or that you're planning on buying, John?
You could put me on the spot. Why don't you tell me yours, and I'll do what every good gamer does and go to his Amazon wish list.
Yeah. Well, most recently, I because my characters are leveling up so quick in the adventure tactics, I had to buy that Hero Pack 1, which was pretty affordable for being slim content. It was pretty affordable to get online. And then coming up soon, I'm pretty hot on the idea of Fort's Cats and Dogs expansion, not only because is that, like a cool addition thematically to the game. And I also really like that as a tiny little deck building game, but it's more Kyle Farron artwork, and it's Kyle Farron artwork of adorable cats and dogs. So how can I resist?
Those are great examples. I don't have good examples off the top of my head, because actually my most recent ones would be a lot of Marvel Champions and Arkham Horror LCG, which again is great because it adds campaign. In some respects, it adds campaign, which story material, that's an always easy to add one. If it's a story-based game and you play it consistently enough, well, then you're going to want more story. It also adds deck building options, and it adds the variety of adding new characters and things like that. So it's got all of the things that you really like about an expansion. But it's an expandable game by design. So let me just call out then, since I don't have goods, let me just call it on my Amazon wish list. I have a little side wish list buried here. It's buried that I haven't looked at in a while, and it's got some things on there. I've purged a few of these. It's got Seven Wonders Armada. It's got the
okay.
Dune Ixians and Telex. I can't pronounce it. You pronounce it.
Talaxians.
Telexians.
Or it's Talaxu.
I can't pronounce it when it's spelled Talaxu. Yeah.
Yeah, so like we could get into Dune lore side podcast here, the Teliaxu or the Teliaxins, and there's also like different generations within the Galactic Empire. Are we talking about the time in which we're under the Landsraad, or are we talking about the time under the God Emperor? In which case we've moved into the Ben Teliaxu as like a whole separate entity. Is the whole thing. They're the gross little goblin people who make like oxalotl tanks out of the women of their species. It's terrible.
My point is, I also have the Cry Havoc expansion Aftermath. So those are 3 expansions that are in my list that I will not be buying, and I'll be purging those from this list here. But at some point or another, the obsessive consumer part of me thought it was important enough that when I bought the game, the base game, I immediately went out to my Amazon wish list just to kind of keep an eye on it. Maybe if it goes on sale, I'll pick it up. And luckily, I never did, because I honestly wouldn't find any value in all 3 of those.
All right.
Good case of being a good consumer.
Yeah, good on you, John. You know what? Pat yourself on the back. You deserve it. You deserve it. Look at you being responsible. We become such responsible adults. You would have never guessed it if you came and played games with us 10 years ago. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating. This has been a blast to talk to you about this, John. For those of you who haven't joined the Discord, I highly recommend that you do that. It's a great way of talking to us and telling us how we're wrong about all these expansions, as well as giving us topic ideas for future shows in which you'd like to see some discussion on or hear some discussion, because this is also going up on the podcast channel. Always welcoming feedback, always welcoming ideas. What you like, what you don't, put it in the comments. Come to Discord, you can comment there, and we'd love to talk to you further. And I guess until next time, I've been Jack, he's been John. John, thanks for coming back onto the Cardboard Herald.
We'll see you next time.
And end.